I figure that any workshop that starts with a reference to Eddie Izzard has got to be something that I want to be involved with, so thank you for that. It makes me feel much more comfortable. Yes, my name is Nigel Thorne. Many of you will have seen me before. I have been a landscape architect now for over 40 years. And I figure that my love of jigsaw puzzles as a child led me into the world of landscape management that I now talk about today. I hope that nothing that I say this afternoon comes as a major surprise to anybody. In fact, I hope that you're all going to sit there at the end of this and say, well, what's this idiot been talking about? I know all of this. Well, if you do, why am I still talking about it 40 years on? And nothing other than common sense is what this is all about. And I hope that we will all recognize that in today's world, there really isn't any such thing as a natural landscape. Humans have managed to contaminate most every part of the world. And on the basis that we can only ever really talk about semi-natural landscape or man-made landscape, then I think the entire process of landscape management needs to raise its game in everybody's mind. So the next 25, 30 minutes is me trying to summarize 40 years of talking to audiences, trying to give them a flavor of what landscape management should be about. And I shall try and keep it exceptionally simple, because actually the only thing that is rocket science, strangely enough, is rocket science. So, what is our management plan all about? Fairly obvious. To manage. Why do we need to manage? Well, if we don't manage, then actually everything is just going to fall apart. And when I first walked around the square when I was last here, I realized actually it's a classic case of where things are really, really falling apart. Because we don't really understand what management involves. And too much hands-off, and everything falls apart. Too much hands-on, and the space doesn't become what everybody wishes that space to be. So we need to manage, starting at a strategic level, and then working our way down to an everyday level. Equally, we need to maintain, because whatever we are managing, unless we are doing the more intimate involvement and engagement of actually maintaining every single little thing that we have in any particular space, then again, that space will fall apart. It won't be what we intended it to be. Landscape in particular is an asset that changes every single day. What you saw yesterday is not the same as what you see today. It may be minuscule change, but it's still change. And it's never, ever just a project. Landscape is always a process. You will be managing and maintaining that forever, not just for today and tomorrow. But the idea is also that we need to develop. Because what was relevant 50, 100, 150 years ago, in whatever landscape we were looking at then, is not necessarily relevant today. You have to make your heritage features, your conservation features, your everyday landscape relevant to the 21st century. And in making it relevant to today, equally, you have to make it relevant for tomorrow. Again, not rocket science. And as you're developing, the idea will always be to improve it. If you're not making it better, if you're not making it more relevant, if you're not making it for the people of the moment, then again, you are failing in your process to make your management plan have relevance. And that's what a management plan is for. It has to have relevance to what you originally designed and what you intend the future to hold for it. Planning the plan. Now, I was a bit worried when I was asked to come to the last workshop, because you're already a long way through the design competition. And I'm wondering whether or not you actually know enough about the square that you're designing in order to be able to design it and make it relevant for now and the future. It takes a great deal of time to plan your management plan. You need to better understand the entirety of the site that you've got in the first instance in order to obtain that broad outline. So you started with a principle. You needed to redesign the square. Why did you need to redesign the square? What is it about the square that's giving you the challenge in the first place? Have you really, all of you, sat down as an integrated stakeholder group and decided what it is you broadly wish to see, other than it needs to be better? Needs to be better in what way? A challenge for you. So you need to have that broad outline to start with. It has to be well thought through. Because believe you me, I've been doing this for 40 years. Have I ever written a perfect landscape management plan? Of course, no, I haven't. Of course I haven't. Nothing is ever perfect, because a landscape management plan will always be evolving. It will always evolve because it has to be relevant for the moment. So whatever you do today, you need to acknowledge it may well have to change. And the influences that come in from all of the audiences involved need to be listened to. They needed to be acted upon in a particular way. And that needs to be taken forward. And change needs to be allowed for. So before you write anything, you have to better understand what it is you are trying to achieve with this. If you don't understand where you're starting from, you haven't got a hope in hell of going forward in order to achieve anything. So all of these things, common sense. Start from a position of strength. If you know what it is you're trying to achieve, you've got some hope in the future of actually getting there. Why? If none of you in this room actually believe that you need one, then why are we bothering? But the very fact that you've asked me to come over here, I figure that probably you recognize that one is actually needed. So you then have to think through what it is it's going to achieve for you. This consultation business. I remember when I first started getting involved with consultation in the UK, it was really a bit like all the professionals get together. I know what it is I'm talking about. We'll talk to the general public. We'll talk to those who maybe show that they've got an interest in any particular site, and then we'll go ahead and do whatever it was we wanted to do in the first place. Still happens. Still happens. And that actually is shameful. Because yes, of course, you need leadership. Yes, of course, you need those professionals involved who will be able to better inform those who are interested in any particular project what is good, what is bad, what is indifferent, what paths you can take and what you can't. But actually, you as an individual, even you as a professional, will learn from the everyday person in the street what that space out there means to them. How do they engage with it? What do they expect from it? What is it they want when they visit Charles Square? Is it just simply to go and sit somewhere quiet? I sat in there the last time I was here for about 3/4 of an hour. It's nice to even have 3/4 of an hour to sit for a while. And when I looked how people used the square, actually I saw more how they abused the square, because that's what they could do. They could go most anywhere. There was no direction, there was no form, there was no format. It was an abuse of what should be a beautiful public space. And people need to be reminded that actually public space is an incredibly valuable thing to have in any urban environment. So you need to get others involved. You need to get lots of people involved. Who are they? You name it. They could be anybody. You need to be prepared to work through ideas, thoughts, challenges. And there will be some really mad ideas out there. There always are. But this is about moderation. This is about getting consensus. This is about bringing everybody together. Managing expectations is always the key to getting the right sort of solutions. And just because today you decide on something, and that's where you start in your management plan, doesn't mean to say that in maybe 6 months, a year's time, you haven't reflected upon it, and maybe you need to change it. You may need just to tweak it. May need a slight change. But what you have to do is remember, change is necessary and important. If you start this process, it needs to be continued. You have to recognize that you're now on a path of continued future engagement. This isn't about a one-off. You don't just suddenly write the management plan, get everybody involved, everybody's happy, and then you walk away. This management plan then sits on a shelf, does nothing, gathers dust, and then in 5 years' time, when you suddenly realize that the date you put on it originally is now run out, oops, we better do something else. This always has to be a live document. And in doing that, in acknowledging that there is a continuity to this, you then have to have the capacity by which to make sure it does continue. So you're investing in this the entire time. Do you have the resource? Do you have the people? Do you have the will? All of these things need to be considered. Change. My word. Mention change to most people of society, and they start to freak. Nobody likes to see change. I want to park my car there. I've parked my car there for the last 40 years. Well, just because you parked your car there for the last 40 years, is that being considerate of all the other people who, A, maybe don't want to see a car parked there, or maybe want to park their car there too? So many different ways of looking at something. But you need to prepare people that change is going to happen. You have an enormously influential public open space across the road. You can't just go across there and suddenly change everything that's going to, in some way, enliven that space in, we hope, a better way, without there being controversy, without there being conflict, and that's what you're needing to manage throughout your entire landscape management engagement process. Information and recording. One of the things that really drives me mad is a failure to acknowledge legacy. You need to understand what's out there. And if you don't understand what you've already got, you have no idea what it is you're going to get in the future. Gather as much information as you possibly can. You never know when that information is going to come in handy, and on everything you can possibly think of, from the glaringly obvious, the paths, the furniture, the heritage factors, the statues. They're there. Your history ought to be able to tell you that fairly rapidly. But then the landform, the trees, the plants, the shrubs, why are they there? What do they signify? When were they planted? Etc., etc. Recording that information, retaining that information, making sure you can access that information for the future, vitally important. Because the number of times I have seen people reinventing the wheel, just going back over the same thing. It was tried, it failed. Why did it fail? Did it fail because of that particular moment in time? Or is there a possibility that to reintroduce it might work? But unless you have that information recorded, you're wasting your time. How are you going to make those decisions? You can't just suddenly turn around and say, well, I'm the boss. my decision, that's what's going to happen. You've got to think that through. If you're consulting, like I said, it's not just about going to the people, whoever they may be, asking them their opinion, and then turning around and saying, well, we're going to do this anyway. How are you going to base your ultimate decisions on the information that you've just gathered? A lot of it will be to do with money. It always is. It always comes down to money and resource. But unless you reason that through, then actually all you're doing to the people that you've engaged with is telling them their opinion wasn't worth giving in the first place. You will make more people upset. You will push more people away and antagonize more if you do not give them, in the initial instance, a grounding and a better understanding of what it is they need to be able to determine the future is going to be. Again, setting standards. Most every organization has a variety of policies, a variety of directional diktats, against which you have to either accept or challenge and push. Why were particular policies put in place? Hopefully, for the right reasons, hopefully to retain and maintain standards. But it doesn't mean to say they can't be challenged. Every policy that was maybe positioned in the past doesn't necessarily still have its relevance today. Be aware of that. Do push at the doors. And then ultimately set those standards. There has to be a strategy. When I was reading the information at the entrance here at camp, it's really, really quite a challenge. Admirable challenge for the entire city. And you have the basis of the strategy out there. And all of your green spaces, all of your urban squares, all of your entire landscape strategic thinking has to be planned for. Because if you don't plan it, then actually it will just fall apart. It has to be a comprehensive whole, not just one by one by one. Each site has to have its own specific landscape management plan, yes. But in the round, the strategic approach to your entire city is important equally. When, how, who, what. Not only in the build-up to creating the landscape management plan, but the implementation thereafter. You need to be able to plan all of the various things that you wish to do in order to gain this information, in order to go out, have that capacity building, get those people involved, whoever they may be. You need to plan those workshops, those invitations, how many, who's going to run them, what are you anticipating in terms of outcomes, and what are you going to do with those outcomes once you have them. Action planning from the very beginning. Other. I always love the other. Because whatever it is you haven't thought of yet, I can assure you somebody will come along and tell you that you should have thought of it, and then you have to reconsider. So always be prepared to add something more to it. Because, as I say, have I ever written the perfect landscape management plan? Doesn't matter how perfect I am, ask my wife. No, I haven't. I can assure you my wife would not say I was perfect. All of these pictures, by the way, are taken from a project in Sheffield, in the middle, the northeast of the UK. It was an award that I gave as president of the Landscape Institute many years ago for the gold route that completely transformed the city centre in Sheffield, leading from the station right to the heart of the city. So, who needs the landscape management plan? Quite frankly, everybody from the policy makers, the decision makers, the budget holders, the financiers, right down to the everyday person that walks on site. Right down to the general member of the public who may just go and sit there at lunchtime to eat their sandwiches or whatever. Why do they need it? Because if you've gone to the bother of anticipating the need for a management plan here, then everybody needs to understand it. Why is it you are managing this particular space in this particular way at this particular time of year? Your management plan should be simple, legible, and accessible to everybody so they better understand. The project I'm working on at the moment, the number of complaints we get because people assume always the worst. They always assume, for whatever reason, that we are out to make negative impact rather than positive impact. And if they're going to assume that, you have to combat that, not by standing and arguing with them, but by showing that your management plan has been carefully thought through. They can then access this either in physical form or online or whatever, because you have to be transparent with this. Again, it has to be available, it has to be accessible to anybody that wishes to see it. Hence, they will all understand why it is you're doing what you're doing. How is it going to be used? Well, specifically, every day, it's going to be used by your maintenance crews who go out there and have to implement the required actions of your management operations as a member of staff. It's equally going to be used by your overall landscape manager, whoever that may be, in order to go to those who are financing, resourcing, giving budgets annually to the entire process, such that you have an argument as to why you need the money. If you just go along to somebody and say, actually, what we want to do is completely refurbish the fountain in the center of the square. Why? What justification do you have for that? How is that in any way sustainable? You're using public water. You need to be able to clean that. People might step in it, might try and drink it. So many different factors. Huge, huge jigsaw puzzle that you have to be able to justify. So you're not going to get money for any aspirational task that you require for any particular site unless you can justify it. You can show that actually this was part of the original concept. This is why we're doing it. Equally, the person on the site who's actually physically having to do the work, they need to understand why they're doing something, what it is they're doing, when it needs to be done, and why ultimately they are doing it in a particular way. And I have seen so many landscape management plans that are written, they're very good, but there's no explanation. There's no handing down of that information to the staff that need to implement what it is you are trying to achieve. And equally, the number of the members of public that go in and just assume you're doing it all wrong, because they always know better. I always say about the Brits, we're all fantastic horticulturists. Give somebody a pot plant or a house plant, suddenly you're an expert in horticulture and landscape. Never know quite how. Who should be involved? And again, this goes from top down and bottom up. Some of the most important people that need to be involved with this are the general public. Those residents, local communities, businesses, visitors to the square, they all need to be engaged. They all need to be approached. They all need the invitation to be given to them, to come and join in, to give us your opinion. The politicians need to be involved, because you need to be able to convince the politicians that they need to financially back this. They need to be behind it in order for it to succeed. Now, we have to be wary about politicians, because quite often, the only time they ever get engaged in anything is when they want to be re-elected. Well, use it. If that's the only time they want to be engaged, make sure that they're there. Make sure they can make some promises. But what you also have to remember is, and I always say this with a question mark, politicians are humans too. Well, most of them. They are like you and me. You vote for them. If you're voting for them, you need to persuade them. They need to be engaged. And then you You may well be a professional landscape architect. You may be a professional architect. You may be whatever profession you choose to follow. But you're also somebody that uses parks. Surely, you go and sit in the space. You walk through it. You do whatever. And if you do, you have an opinion about it. Engage with that process. Feed into it. And that allowance needs to be made. Aha. So who's going to write this thing? Ultimately, it needs to be the responsibility of just one person. But that person won't be writing it alone. He or she will be taking the feedback from the entire engagement process. I've got 8 minutes to sum up the next 35 years, sorry. They need to take all of the information that's coming along and be able to write it such that it follows a logical path, it's understood by everybody, and thereafter it makes sense. What will it achieve? Hopefully, some sort of focus. The idea is that if you have this management plan, it will be able to give you direction. It will be able to highlight the aims and ambitions, aims and objectives of what you want to see that space perform in the future. How you're going to change it, where it's going to go, what it's going to do for everybody. And again, you need to be aspirational in your approach to writing a landscape management plan. Don't just say, oh, well, we haven't got the money now. Well, you may not have the money now. But there will be times when actually grant funding is available, maybe future sponsors. There are people out there that can give you money. And unless you have aspiration written into your landscape management plan, again, you are failing in your duty to make that space over there somewhere that everybody wishes to go. What will it look like? Do you know what? I have no idea. What it ought not to be, and I know this from experience, is just a dirge. It should not be just a series of very, very closely written, finite text that nobody is ever going to read. Make it exciting. Make it look as though somebody might want to engage with it. As a profession, we are a visual profession as landscape architects. We can do some great stuff. That can be engendered within any landscape management plan. And I hope in the next presentation I'll show you a few bits like that. But it doesn't have to be 45, 50, 150 pages. It needs to be relevant for the site that you are dealing with. Don't over-egg the pudding. Just make it what it needs to be for the site that you have in hand. Over the road, you've got a very complex site. Hence, the complexity of that landscape management plan will necessarily be quite contrived. If that's for me, I'm out. Unless you know where you're starting from, you haven't got a hope in hell of getting anywhere. So many people massively underestimate the assessment process that goes into what you have over the road. In the space of 45 minutes of sitting over there, I had so many things going through my head of what I could see that was not necessarily useful for that particular public space, and so many other things that I thought, yes, we could go down this path, we could go down this path, etc., etc. You need to fully understand. So you need to look at the history, the heritage, the culture, and you need to see how that is reflected today. If you fail to understand that, then you have already failed to get a landscape management plan that has any sense or real meaning. What are your expectations and ambitions for this site? What aspirational things would you like to see change? Even if it's just at the very simplest form of maybe the grass being much more floristically exciting, having a wildlife value, an ecological value. Something as simple as that can completely change the face of whatever space you're dealing with. But unless you have those ambitions and expectations, it's going to fail. And again, you get those through discussion, consultation, and engagement. How are you going to achieve this? And again, simplistically, what do we need? We need the money. What do we need? We need the expertise. When are we going to do this? Is it going to be now? Is it going to be in 3 years? Is it going to be in 5 years? Does it need to be an immediate change? But you have to recognize, you have to put a realistic timescale on it. And it has to be measurable once you're going to do it. Because unless you assess what it is you're trying to achieve, to see whether or not it's been successful, you've again wasted your time putting the landscape management plan together. So where are we now? Again, the history, the heritage, everything that you've got needs to be fully identified. Oh, sorry, pressing the wrong button. Look at the policies you have for the city. How does this particular site fit in with the policies you have going here, there, and everywhere? What do you need to reflect upon in order to include in your plan? And then you need to be able to describe it fully and in detail. Where is it you wish to be? What is it you wish to achieve? Your vision. Again, this could be quite simple, but it could be quite aspirational. And again, that can come around in stages. It could be a year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. The best landscape management plan I ever came across was the City of London. They wrote a 500-year landscape management plan for Burnham Beaches. Why 500 years? What could they possibly know that's going to happen in 500 years? Well, very little. But starting from the fact that they were managing a landscape that had already been around for over 1,000 years, they knew they had something special on their hands. So let's not underestimate the power of landscape. Equally, the assessment and the analysis, once again, needs to be comprehensively acknowledged. Otherwise, you have no idea how you're going to get there. It's a journey. It's a journey that will throw up challenges. But unless you take on those challenges, this isn't going to work. And the aims and objectives. Even if you just said, we want Karlova Square to be so much more beautiful. So what are the objectives? To make that beauty encouraged and happened, and thereafter maintained and improved. This is one of the key elements to any landscape management plan. You have to have an action plan. You have to list every single thing that you intend to do. You have to put a realistic timetable against it. It has to be achievable. It has to be measurable. But overall, it has to be costed. If you don't have the money to do it, then quite frankly, you haven't got a hope in hell of seeing it happen. So you've got to understand that realistically, it's achievable because you can afford to do it. And in doing that, you will always need the money and the backing behind you. And again, capital investment alone is not sufficient. You can make anything beautiful by throwing capital money at it. It's the revenue investment that will genuinely make it work. So you've got to make sure that whatever capital investment you're making, you have the follow-up revenue investment that goes over many, many years to follow that will make whatever you've invested worthwhile. You then have to have the resource to make it happen. You need the management staff. You need the maintenance staff. You need the continued line of training. Because if they don't know what they're doing, either the management or the maintenance staff, you've blown it again. And there are so few intimately trained individuals out there who genuinely even know how to maybe lay turf or even cut grass properly or why they're cutting grass in a particular way. Simple, simple things. And again, This is key to a successful management plan. You'll be delighted to know I'm very nearly finished. I've probably only got about half a second left. But talk about race through. You need to monitor it. Somebody needs to be on top of this landscape management plan the entire time to make sure you're not going off the rails. You set aims, ambitions, and aspirations. Are you achieving those? If you are, fantastic. How well are you doing? Assess what it is you're doing. Is it the right thing? Is it the right thing at the right time? Is it costing more than you anticipated? Could you do it any better? Could you do it more cheaply? Sorry, inexpensively. I don't like cheap. Never do anything cheaply. But unless you assess, you're never going to know. And again, I've seen so many landscape management plans, aspirational, all the stuff involved, but nobody goes back and checks. And what you should be doing is reviewing. And again, you are reviewing with everybody. From the person in the street that's saying, wow, that's fantastic, or, oh my word, what do you think you are doing? That is awful. Review all of that stuff. The staff that have got to implement this plan, have they bought into it? Do they genuinely believe in what they're doing? Do they think something could be done better? It is entirely within their remit to respond to and feed back into this entire process. It's all about engagement. It's all about believing. It's all about making it relevant to the site that you have in front of you. Without it, just a pretty picture. You've done some great design. You've implemented a great project. After that, it'll go to hell like everything else. You need this from the beginning. Your design needs to be influenced by your landscape management plan. And if it isn't an integral part of the entire process, from my opinion, you failed. And on that happy note, thank you. Okay, firstly, my apologies. It's me again, so no change in the audience. You can still fall asleep. This bit's a bit more tricky. What I'd like to do is just run through a project that I have been involved with for the past 2.5 years. It's a very specific project, and it involves a Victorian cemetery in the southwest of London. It's called Brompton Cemetery. Its heritage and history is highly significant for the City of London. It is one of what is called the Magnificent Seven cemeteries that were built in the mid-1800s, about 1840, in order to cope with the excessive number of deaths from the cholera epidemic that was running rife across the city at that time. The major investment that happened in those days was obviously significant. And since the 1840s, really all that has happened is that Brompton Cemetery has been filling up with bodies and, in terms of management and maintenance, going downhill rapidly. To the extent that 2 years ago, we were awarded nearly £6.2 million to invest in the upgrading of this particular site. Now, the significance of that money is that it came via a very particular route. It was from the Heritage Lottery and Big Lottery funds under a program called Parks for People. And Parks for People require 3 things of any grant application: that the project involves heritage, it involves people, and it involves communities. So the fundamental requirement of this entire project was stakeholder engagement. I hate that phrase. It's talking to people. That's what it's about. People who may have an interest in this site. One of the specific requirements, obviously, was that if we were going to invest £6.2 million worth of public money in a public open space that is free at the point of access to the public, its future must mean that all of the features on site, with exception to the private graves, of course, have to be more readily available to the public. We have grade-listed buildings. The landscape itself, over 16 hectares, is a Grade 1 listed historic landscape. That gives it significance in its own right. And what it was telling the owners of the site, i.e. the Secretary of State and the managers of the site, who are the Royal Parks, is that they now have an even greater responsibility to ensure that whatever money has been invested wisely. So how are you going to be looking after this project in the future? I came in merely for the delivery phase. The development phase leading up to the project getting sponsorship was done by somebody else. This was a challenge for me because I had had no influence over the landscape management and conservation management plan that you see before you. For me, this was already fundamentally flawed. So like I say, have I ever written a perfect management plan? No, I haven't. And this was fundamentally flawed because, in my mind, from my professional perspective, you cannot separate the conservation management plan, i.e. the heritage, the built form, the infrastructure, from the landscape. And in actual fact, this landscape was quite unique in terms of its design. It was designed by architect and landscape architect working together. Now, even in the 21st century, actually getting an architect to work closely with a landscape architect is a bit like pulling teeth. It's not the easiest thing to make happen. So for this to happen in the 1830s and 40s was really quite remarkable. A designed landscape with the structures, features, path, layout, all engaged in the historic landscape setting. This was the challenge for the landscape management plan in the future. So the fact that all of the conservation management plan information relating to the chapel, relating to the colonnades, the catacombs, and the other lodges that were equally all Grade 2 listed or Grade 2 star, for that to be in a separate management plan is unacceptable to me. So we've been working to try and combine this. Now, I'm not going to go through everything on this because there's no point. We've talked about the generic type of approach in what we are expecting from a landscape management plan. But it has to be fundamental. You have to understand all of the bits and pieces that go with it. Just by looking at the site and saying, what do we have here? Well, we have paths, we have buildings, we have individual buildings, etc., etc., etc. And all of that adds up. I'm now going to give a challenge to the technicians here. Could you switch to the second one? Now this is the overall landscape management plan. And again, for me, this was fairly tedious, inaccessible. It's not what I would expect anybody could go and pick up and necessarily understand. Now, it's not that it's bad. There's nothing bad about it. It's just that it's not as accessible as I would like it to be. Again, we have this list of stuff that it needs to cover. Important, of course it's important. You can't just decry all of this stuff. But it does dictate what it's there to be. So far, all we've seen is text, okay? Not very exciting. Not doing my genes any good at all, this. It's just text. Important text, but I can assure you that the majority of the public are already put off. They're not going to read this stuff. Again, nice history. If you're into research, great. Go into this, read it as much as you like. I haven't seen anything that inspires me yet, that gives me a genuine desire to engage with all of this. And we go on. I'm not expecting you to read this, because I wouldn't. Could we have the next one, please? So what we decided to do was try and bring out something that everybody who might have an interest in this project might better be able to understand going forward. And if you consider the entire process, the project, was all about engaging with the public, this is something the public should be better able to understand when they go into site and when they start shouting at me, "You're killing all of the wildlife. You're destroying everything in here." Now, maybe through ignorance, and I don't mean that harshly, but lack of understanding, that's all they can see. And I could stand there and say, no, of course we're not doing that, and they won't believe me. But if you can point to something that visually and pictorially shows them what you're trying to achieve, then maybe you've got a better chance of them believing you when you're trying to convince them you're doing this for all the right reasons. So we produced a summary document. Like I said, the other two documents, vitally important, but maybe for a different type of user. If necessary, you can reflect back on those and take your inquirer to the more informed, the more detailed elements of the landscape management plan. But this is the one that I prefer to refer to when people are challenging us. Now, if you can imagine, this is a grade 1 listed landscape in which sit grade listed buildings. So these are protected in their own right. It's a cemetery. Lots of arguments about whether a cemetery is a public open space. Well, from my perspective, a cemetery is most definitely a public open space. It's just like any other public open space, with the added bonus of commemoration and many, many more historic features. Slight twist on that, just my interpretation. So, a significant site, definitely in need of a landscape management plan. Why? Because at the beginning of this entire stakeholder engagement process, we had those on one side of the fence saying that the grass had to be fine mown lawn across the entire site. All of the monuments needed to be vertical, cleaned, legible. All of the gravestones needed to be horizontal, cleaned, perfect. That was never going to happen. Can you imagine how much money that would cost to instigate? And equally, the site is a conservation area. You would have denuded the entire space of all of its biodiversity, all of its ecology, and all of its added value in terms of wildlife in an urban environment. At the other end of the spectrum, we had those in the stakeholder group saying it needs to be completely overrun. The brambles, the ivy, the bracken need to take over everything because that's the best thing for the wildlife. It needs to be a truly urban wildlife space. Well, think about it. If you have a loved one buried in this cemetery and you can't go and find the grave because it's overrun with brambles and ivy and bracken and everything else, is that acceptable? Of course it isn't. So we come back to managing expectations. So just as that was neither useful, ecologically sound, a genuine gain for an urban public space, as was the other end of the spectrum where it was all going to be completely and utterly sterile, you have to manage expectation and come somewhere in the middle. We have to maintain that conservation basis. We have to maintain the original integrity of the conceptual designed landscape. That is a massive challenge. So we start off by giving an historic flavor, an original map of the layout of the cemetery. Inside this space, we have over 206,000 burials. It is still an operational burial space, an added challenge to any public open space. Again, we've tried to keep it quite brief. We've identified the specific areas that we believe are in need of attention and that most people on the street are interested in. Many, many more diagrammatic pieces of information, much more colourful, much more engaging. It gives you the opportunity to take the very basic levels of information and relate to exactly where they might be in the space itself. If you want to then find out more information about any one of those things, you can refer back to the master plan. Baseline information, such that anybody that's coming to the site for the first time, you can have this accessible on your phone. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to have this in physical format. Just going to the site with the information is available on your phone. The entire investment program has also added an interpretation strategy for the visitor going to the cemetery. So instead of waiting to go on a tour led by a particular expert, you can now go round and find out these things just by looking on your phone. There is a virtual tour. You don't even have to go to site now. You can sit at home and do the virtual tour yourself. All of this information is available via the internet, which is vitally important because it has to be transparent. People need to know what it is you're trying to achieve and how and when and what you're going to be doing to get there. Again, pretty pictures. It just makes the entire document slightly more tangible and real in terms of what you're trying to achieve. We also need to highlight the challenges. And we've put in the anticipated approach to various elements of management. We know, for instance, these areas of bracken immediately adjacent the access paths are not a good thing. So we've highlighted what the problem is. We've then described what we are trying to do in order to control that, not eliminate it. It's not a point of going in and eradicating things. It's a matter of control. And of course, people see this quite often and assume everything is untended. Well, actually, in the past, they had a point, because it was. Until recently, this was a site that was in much need of TLC, tender loving care. What we had, and why the Royal Parks actually headed down this path of looking for money to invest in the site, was a group of local volunteers, the Friends of Brompton Cemetery. These were all local stakeholders who could see this beautiful London site going to rack and ruin. They got together, they began intervening in the management and maintenance operations on this site, almost giving a proverbial kick up the backside to the Royal Parks, saying, you're not doing this right. You are not respecting this site in the way that you should. And hence, we are now in the position that we are today, having engaged with them in the entirety. And again, we've had to challenge some of their views. We've had to challenge some of the operations that they have introduced into the operation of the cemetery, because it wasn't right. We've brought in the horticulturalists, the ecologists, the wildlife specialists. And what they've done is they've assessed the entire site. What do we have here? And in 2016, we had what was called a BioBlitz event. BioBlitz is an ecological event that goes on for 24 hours, where people actually come to site, they stay on site for 24 hours, they investigate. These are people from the general public, led by professional ecologists, horticulturists, etc., looking to see what species we have on site. It makes the entire research program so much more exciting. We had people from local schools, the kids from local schools, starting at the age of 3 and 4. Just watching them on their hands and knees, looking at ants' nests, was a delight. And then going up to the specialists who were looking out for bats and butterflies and all of the varieties that we were anticipating. But again, introduced via the landscape management plan, engaging with people. The master plan. We are never going to put this site back into the same manner and design that the concept aligned for back in the 1840s. That would not be appropriate. For a start, 206,000 burials dictates that we don't have the same amount of space that they had when they first designed this site. What we're trying to do is reflect the original design concept, making it appropriate for today. What we do know is that back in 1840, when John Claudius Loudon, the great-grandfather of all cemetery design, first designed this site, he didn't know what he was doing either. This was the first time he'd ever designed a site of this nature. And his expectation, if you read his seminal book on cemetery design, was that it would change. It would become relevant. And we had to make this site, continuing to be relevant for the 21st century. Things like this. Grade 2 star building in a landscape. At the start of this project, this sat empty. 98% of the time, it was a building doing nothing. My initial project office was in this east wing, which is now public toilets. I think it's appropriate for my office. The future of the building in relation to the landscape was what? Well, we didn't know. What we did know is it's not consecrated ground, so it doesn't just have to be anything to do with the church. And in fact, if it was just to do with the church, it would have failed in its future expectations. What it is now is a learning space, an education space, it's a presentation space, it's an exhibition space, it's whatever you wish to make it. And in fact, only yesterday, I was down in the southwest of the country talking to another cemetery who run weddings from their chapel spaces. Weddings in a cemetery? Do people think that's appropriate? Well, I can tell you that the very last lecture that we held in this chapel space before we renovated it was during the month of the dead. Yes, there is such a thing as the month of the dead. In October 2016, the very last lecture was on the approachable face of necrophilia. I'm not sure what that is in Czech, but it's just as inappropriate in English as it is in Czech, I'm sure. You could not get a seat for love nor money. It was packed. Everybody wanted to find out what the acceptable face of necrophilia was. I still have no idea, by the way. I didn't go. I couldn't get a seat. However, because now this area has public toilets, that means we can do most anything inside this chapel that people find they wish to present. And it's all about engaging with the local people, the local communities, the local residents, saying to them, come on, use the building now. It's been quite incredible. We now have over 200 events planned for the next 12 months on this site. And previously, there was virtually nothing other than a few tours run by 1 or 2 local volunteers. That is all in the management plan. We have associated our action plan with all of these expectations and requirements. Running alongside that, we have ecology and habitat expectations. So we can't overrun this site with events because we need to retain, increase, improve, extend all of our habitat expectations in terms of the general landscape. We know during that 24-hour BioBlitz exercise, we discovered about 8 new species that we didn't know were on this site. Equally, that was just merely 24 hours. We know that research has to go on. The Royal Parks have their own ecologists, their own horticulturists. They are discovering things the entire time. That all has to be included in any future upgrade of the landscape management plan. When I talked about referring to various policies, We know that there are general expectations, either local, regional, national, or international, that we have to comply with. That is reflected in the general expectation on this site. We have our own beehives in the cemetery. We make our own honey in the cemetery. We sell that on our open days. A sideline for a cemetery is what happens. We are now planting horticultural areas that will encourage more bees and more wildlife expectation. The chapel, before we started work on it, we knew was a temporary roost for bats. National policy means that we are not allowed to disturb bats, protected species. So we had to provide, just in case, because there was no recent evidence of bats roosting in the chapel. Oh, sorry. We had to provide potential bat roosting areas in the trees in and around that chapel. Just part of the management plan that we will now expect the bats, if they're going to roost again, they will roost back in the chapel dome. One of the fundamental expectations on this site was all about views and vistas. Even up here at the North Lodge entrance, we have 2 new pavilions. We've introduced a cafe to the cemetery. My word, was that a huge challenge. Again, stakeholder engagement. Cafe in a cemetery? Totally unacceptable. The person that was giving us most grief about having a cafe in the cemetery, that person was one of the first people to use the cafe when it opened on the 13th of April. If only I had taken that picture. That person gave me so much grief about the inappropriate nature of having a cafe in the cemetery. We have a new visitor center, but both of those new pavilions that have been designed in a very modern way, but reflecting the historic architecture, they have been designed such that the original vista from the main road here is maintained through the cafe building, through the visitor center building, all the way down through to the colonnades, even now. And when you point that out to all of our visitors, and they all go, marvelous, what a fantastic thought. And yet, so simple, but it could have been destroyed. And it could have been destroyed because when we got the person in to design the interior of the cafe, they wanted to put the counter right across that line of vision. And the challenge we had to get them to change their design was really quite interesting. So it's talking about the long views, getting people to understand why perhaps we are cutting down stands of bramble. Why it is that actually that bramble growing in the extent, the height, and the breadth that it is inappropriate is a real challenge because people just think we are destroying habitat. Whereas actually we know the value in that habitat only comes from a rotational cut. We don't want to get rid of the bramble, we need it. But actually it was far too big, it was far too all-encompassing, and it needed to be controlled. You could imagine getting up every morning and having to walk through this site. It's been a real struggle for 2.5 years. Absolutely stunning. Pathways. Something as simple as pathways. I learnt a fantastic lesson right at the start of this process. Because, of course, this site is supposed to be accessible to all. I took around a friend of Richmond Park, one of the royal parks in the southwest of London. She was blind. I made an assumption, because I'm fully sighted, well, I'm not as well sighted as I used to be, but I am allegedly fully sighted, even with these. I took her around. She had a guide dog. I anticipated this to be the safest place on earth. It's flat, easy for me to get around, and da-da-da. After 3 hours of wandering around with her, I said to her, so, how do you feel? She said, it's the unsafest place I have been in a long time. What are you talking about? All of these paths are tarmac. They're on a grid pattern. You can walk anywhere. As a sighted person, that's very easy, very simple. I know where I am. She had not a single point of orientation. Her dog, the guide dog, loves being in public open spaces. Hence, he was just running riot, taking her wherever he wished to take her. There was no intersection between the paths. There was no primary, secondary, tertiary layer of paths in different surfaces. Hence, she had no idea where she was. When she's on the street, in an urban environment with the traffic and traffic lights, she can hear the nuances. She said, I don't even have the wind blowing through different varieties of trees here for me to better orientate myself. It was a real eye-opener for me, appreciating how somebody with whatever disability can interface and react with a sight. And you have to take that into consideration. Don't make assumptions. We all do it. Again, now we've introduced how we are going to change the infrastructure. We can't afford to do it now. We don't have the money, but we know this is an aspiration. We will have a better, accessible system in the future. We've made it measurable, we've made it achievable, and we've made it affordable. But it won't happen for at least 4 to 5 years. We have to build that in to our self-sustaining income on the site. How do we maintain these various areas? This is the bit that's really important. Being able just to draw various areas of the site, trying to show people what we're trying to achieve. Very, very simple illustration. But they then better understand why we're doing it. It's not because we're heathens. It's not because we don't care for the environment. It's not because we're destroying wildlife. It's because this is a better way of managing, to improve all of those things, not to kill them off. And taking real-life pictures and showing how that will respond in the future. What will they see? What can their expectations be? Mother Nature doesn't allow pretty pictures like this just to happen. Just before the beginning of May, the entire site was very low, short grasses. Over one weekend, we had 3 incredibly hot days. 2 days after that, we had intensive rainfall. Within 2 more days, the vegetation was up here. Now, you can't plan for that. Mother Nature turns around and sticks 2 fingers up at you every single time. But this is the aspiration. This is what we're trying to get to. And it will cost to introduce new manpower in order to get on site to maintain it like that every time. It's, again, managing expectations. Showing how they might expect each and every individual compartment to be. Giving the bigger picture, going down to the smaller scale. Trying to help them better understand what it is we're looking to do. We, again, engaged with people from the general public. They were so much more engaged with this because it seemed to be more real. They could better understand. We could take them out, show them on site what we were trying to achieve. Again, horticulture, arboriculture. How are we going to achieve this? Show them the bigger picture, show them what we're trying to get in the future. And then, if they don't understand that, you can explain by reading the text. What we've got on site, what value does it add? And just running through the bits and pieces so they all better understand. I'm going to finish early, that's quite good. Interestingly, the introductions that we've made on site in terms of horticulture, we have some of the original plant finders buried in the cemetery. So Robert Fortune, any plant you know with the title Fortunae behind it. Robert Fortune discovered on his travels to China and the Far East. We have used the plants that he discovered and others buried in the cemetery, the Vetch family. We have used the plants that they brought back to the UK as our new planting palette inside the specific horticultural areas of the cemetery. We highlight that in the management plan. People then better understand why it is a particular plant is in a particular place. And this was the shopping list. We know we still have so much more to do. We haven't been able to achieve that, even with £6.2 million in this one quite tiny site. But the landscape management plan places that aspiration on a variety of levels. What we'll do this year, what we'll do next year, 5 years, 10 years. This is fed into the entire time. It doesn't just sit and gather dust on a shelf. And I think that's about it. Is it perfect? Not by any means. But we're getting there, as they say. Thank you.